High above the frozen skies of Bremen in 1943, a lone B-17 flying fortress, trailing thick black smoke and riddled with jagged flak holes, became the center of a terrifying legend. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at the crippled ship, expecting an easy kill. Instead, they flew into a mathematically perfect slaughter. The American crew didn't survive because of luck. They survived because of a man sitting in the waist of the bomber who shouldn't have been there. A man armed with unauthorized blueprints, an uncanny mind, and a secret that would eventually bring down 17 enemy planes before demanding a devastating, unthinkable sacrifice. The tarmac of RAF Thurley, in the bitter winter of 1943, was a place where hope went to freeze. The men of the 306th Bombardment Group were caught in the bloodiest meat grinder of the air war. Daylight precision bombing sounded brilliant in the briefing rooms of Washington, but at 25,000 feet over hostile European territory, it was a death sentence. The average life expectancy of a bomber crew was roughly 15 missions. They needed 25 to go home. The math was a cruel, unspoken executioner. Captain Thomas Blake, a 24-year-old pilot with the exhausted eyes of an old man, stood beneath the wing of his B-17, the Brass Widow. The heavy bomber was a patchwork of unpainted aluminum skin and desperate field repairs. 2 days prior, they had limped back from a raid over Schweinfurt, with their left waist gunner dead and their tail gunner permanently blinded by shattered plexiglass. Blake was missing 2 men, and the group commander, Major Richard Langdon, had promised him replacements. But when the supply jeep pulled up through the freezing English fog, it didn't bring 2 fresh-faced recruits from gunnery school. It brought 1 man, accompanied by 2 armed military policemen, and 4 heavy, unmarked wooden crates. The man who stepped out of the jeep was Sergeant Elias Ford. He didn't look like a soldier. He was tall, gaunt, and carried a perpetually distracted expression, as if he were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. His uniform was rumpled, his leather flight jacket devoid of any squadron patches or painted art. "Captain Blake?" one of the MPs asked, handing over a manila folder thick with classified stamps. "Sergeant Ford is your new waist gunner and engineer, Major Langdon's orders." Blake flipped open the folder. His brow furrowed as he read the sparse, heavily redacted lines. Elias Ford wasn't a standard gunner. He was a former ballistics engineer from the Aberdeen Proving Ground, court-martialed 6 months ago for gross insubordination and the unauthorized modification of military ordnance. Ford had been sitting in a military prison in Leavenworth until a desperate 8th Air Force general decided that a mad genius might be exactly what the dying bomber fleets needed. "What's in the crates, Sergeant?" Blake asked, his voice rough with fatigue and suspicion. Ford didn't look at Blake. His eyes were already mapping the structural ribs and the .50 caliber machine gun mounts of the Brass Widow. "Hardware, Captain," Ford replied, his voice a flat, almost mechanical monotone. "Calculators, gyroscopic linkages, a few mechanical advantages to tip the statistical probability of our survival." "I don't need statistics, Ford. I need a man who can pull a trigger when the Messerschmitts come diving out of the sun." Ford finally turned his pale gaze to the captain. "Pulling a trigger is easy, Captain Blake. Hitting a target moving at 400 miles an hour, while we are moving at 200 miles an hour, factoring in the Magnus effect, bullet drop, and harmonic vibration of the airframe, is not a matter of reflex. It is a matter of geometry. And the Luftwaffe has superior geometry. I am here to correct that." Before Blake could protest, Ford began hauling the heavy crates up the belly hatch. Over the next 12 hours, while the rest of the crew slept in their freezing Nissen huts, Ford did not. The sounds of ratchets, drilling, and metal grinding echoed from the waist of the Brass Widow all night. Lieutenant David O'Connor, Blake's co-pilot, found Blake in the mess hall at 0400 hours, sipping terrible chicory coffee. "Tom," O'Connor said quietly, "I just walked past the ship. Whatever that new guy is doing in there, he's tearing out the standard mounts. He's got the port and starboard waist guns wired together through some sort of central gearbox bolted to the floor." Blake rubbed his temples. "Langdon said to let him work. Said Ford is a special project. If he breaks my guns, I'll throw him out the bomb bay over the channel." But when Blake and the crew boarded the Widow an hour later for the pre-flight check, they found the waist section transformed. The two heavy Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns were no longer independent weapons. Ford had constructed a crude but brilliantly complex mechanical linkage connecting them to a heavy spinning gyroscope salvaged from a crashed P-47 Thunderbolt, wired directly into the bomber's auxiliary power. The ammunition belts were rerouted into massive, continuous feed chutes that defied standard safety regulations, holding 3 times the normal combat load. "What in God's name is this?" demanded Corporal Samuel Hayes, the radio operator, staring at the mechanical monstrosity. "A synchronized dual-arc defense array," Ford said softly, wiping grease from his hands. "The standard manual operation of these weapons relies on human tracking. Human tracking is flawed by panic, cold, and target fixation. This system," he patted the heavy gyroscope, "stabilizes the guns against the bomber's own roll and pitch. It allows me to calculate lead times mechanically. When I aim one gun, the other tracks the predicted evasive flight path of the target." "You're crazy," Hayes whispered. "If that gear jams, you'll shoot our own tail off." "It won't jam," Ford said, strapping on his Mae West life preserver. "Unless you bleed on the gears, Corporal, please try not to." The flare arched over the control tower. Green. The mission was a go. The target was a heavily fortified Focke-Wulf assembly plant deep in the heart of Bremen. The 8th Air Force was sending 300 bombers. The Luftwaffe would be waiting with 500 fighters. The calculus of death was about to begin. The roar of 1,200 Wright Cyclone engines shaking the English countryside was a sound that rattled the bones and numbed the mind. Inside the cockpit of the Brass Widow, Captain Blake fought the heavy yoke, muscling the massive bomber through the thick layer of clouds and up into the freezing, thin air of 25,000 feet. As they breached the cloud cover, the breathtaking and terrifying sight of the bomber stream revealed itself. Hundreds of B-17's and B-24's glinted in the harsh, unfiltered sunlight, forming combat boxes designed to provide mutually interlocking fields of fire. The theory was that tightly packed bombers could chew up any attacking fighter with a wall of lead. The reality, as Blake knew all too well, was that the German pilots had figured out how to exploit the blind spots. The temperature inside the unpressurized cabin plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Frost instantly coated the plexiglass, and condensation from the men's breath froze into sharp icicles on their oxygen masks. Every man was wrapped in thick sheepskin flight suits and electrically heated blue bunny suits, yet the cold still felt like a physical knife scraping against their ribs. "Oxygen check," Blake called over the intercom, his voice crackling through the static. One by one, the crew checked in. Nose, okay. Top turret, okay. Radio, okay. Ball turret, freezing, but okay. Tail, okay. Silence from the waist. "Waist, Ford. Report," Blake barked. "Waist is optimal." Ford's voice came back, calm and utterly devoid of the nervous tension that gripped the rest of the crew. "Gyroscopes are spooled up. Ambient temperature is affecting the viscosity of the gun oil, but I have wrapped the central gearbox in heated wiring. We are mathematically sound." O'Connor shot Blake a dark look across the cockpit. "Mathematically sound. We've got a lunatic in the back." They crossed the coast of occupied Europe. The English Channel faded behind them, replaced by the grim gray patchwork of France and Belgium. Almost instantly, the sky ahead began to bloom with ugly, black puffs of smoke. "Flak. Flak ahead. Looks like a heavy barrage," O'Connor called out. The Brass Widow shuddered violently as an 88mm shell exploded 100 yards off their right wing. Shrapnel the size of jagged dinner plates rattled against the aluminum hull like deadly hail. The smell of cordite filled the cabin, bitter and metallic. Blake kept his eyes locked on the lead bomber of their element, matching speed and altitude, flying directly into the exploding black clouds. You couldn't dodge flak. You could only pray the geometry of the fuse timer didn't intersect with your aircraft. They made it through the coastal belt, but the relief was fleeting. The radio chatter suddenly spiked with panicked voices from the lead squadrons. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, coming out of the sun. Blake squinted through the glare. At first, they were just specks, like dust on the windshield. But the specks grew with terrifying speed. The Luftwaffe's favored tactic was the head-on pass. A B-17's forward firepower was its weakest point, and a Focke-Wulf 190 coming head-on at a closing speed of over 600 miles an hour was almost impossible to hit. "Here they come!" yelled the top turret gunner. The sky erupted. Tracer fire stitched neon lines across the freezing blue canvas. A B-17 to their immediate left suddenly convulsed. A stream of 20mm cannon shells from an attacking Fly 190 tore through its wing root. The massive wing simply detached, folding upward, and the bomber went into a violent, fatal death spiral, spinning out of the formation. No parachutes emerged. "Fighters breaking through!" Blake yelled. "They're rolling over, coming at our rear quarter." In the waist of the ship, the temperature was a brutal -45. Ice coated the open gun windows, wind screaming through the fuselage at over 200 miles an hour. Corporal Hayes, terrified and clinging to his radio station, watched Elias Ford. Ford stood perfectly still in the center of the vibrating floorboards. He wasn't looking out the window. He was watching a crude, hand-painted dial he had attached to his gyroscopic gearbox. The shrieking roar of twin-engine Bf-110S and radial engine Fly 190S tearing through the bomber stream was deafening. But Ford looked as though he were reading a book in a quiet library. "Ford, they're coming in at 3 o'clock!" Hayes screamed over the intercom. "I know," Ford said softly. An FW-190, with a yellow-painted nose, piloted by a veteran of the Eastern Front, banked sharply, lining up the Brass Widow for a deflection shot. The German pilot knew the math. He knew exactly how long it would take the American waist gunner to swing the heavy, .50 caliber, sight the target, and fire. By the time the American pulled the trigger, the German would already be passing beneath the bomber. But Ford didn't swing the gun to aim at the fighter. He grasped the complex dual handle he had engineered, checked the dial, and aimed at empty sky, a full 300 yards ahead and below the German fighter's current trajectory. He squeezed the firing paddles. Because of the linkages, both the port and starboard guns roared to life simultaneously, even though there was no target on the port side. The heavy M2S shook the entire fuselage, spitting out a massive, continuous wall of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The modified feed chutes bypassed the standard limits, allowing an uninterrupted, devastating stream of lead. The German pilot in the yellow-nosed 190 never even saw it coming. He completed his dive, rolling right into the exact airspace Ford had filled with lead a fraction of a second earlier. It was as if the fighter flew into an invisible brick wall. The .50 caliber rounds sheared off the Focke-Wulf's canopy, obliterated the engine block, and detonated the fuel tanks in a blinding white explosion. "Splash one!" Hayes screamed, his jaw dropping in disbelief. Holy, he flew right into it. "Do not celebrate, Corporal." Ford's voice came over the intercom, completely flat, his hands already rapidly recalibrating the tension springs on his gearbox. That was elementary predictive ballistics. The real test is about to begin. They are adapting. He was right. The Luftwaffe pilots were veterans. They saw the explosion, saw the strange dual firing pattern coming from the waist of the Brass Widow, and they realized this was no ordinary gunner. The radio chatter among the German interceptors, led by the ruthless Oberleutnant Heinrich Wolf, quickly shifted focus. The formation was standard, but this single B-17 was a violent anomaly. "Captain Blake," Ford's voice broke through the chaos of the intercom. "I need you to alter course. Drop our starboard wing by 3 degrees and retard the number 4 engine throttle. Now." "Are you insane, Ford?" Blake roared back. "I break formation. We lose our cover. We become a straggler. They'll tear us apart. If you maintain this vector, Captain, a Bf-109, currently utilizing the blind spot of the bomber beneath us, will sever our tail section in exactly 14 seconds. I cannot hit him from this angle. Drop the wing, or we die." Blake hesitated. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to stay in the box. Breaking formation was suicide. but he remembered the cold, absolute certainty in Ford's eyes on the tarmac. "Do it, Tom," O'Connor yelled, watching a terrifying swarm of fighters gathering below them. Blake gritted his teeth, kicked the right rudder pedal, and dipped the starboard wing, sliding the brass widow slightly out of the protective umbrella of the squadron. 14 seconds later, the sky directly behind where they would have been exploded with 30mm cannon fire. The BF-109 shot up through the gap, its pilot momentarily confused by the empty air. In the waist, Ford was already waiting. The dip in the wing gave his mechanically linked guns the perfect downward angle. He didn't just fire, he engaged the gyroscope's secondary release. The twin guns swept in a synchronized horizontal arc, laying down a scythe of heavy machine gun fire. The BF-109 was caught perfectly in the crossfire. Its port wing disintegrated, and the fighter snapped into a violent tumble, bursting into flames as it plummeted toward the earth. "Splash 2, Ford muttered, his hands moving frantically over his equipment, tightening bolts that were vibrating loose under the immense strain of continuous fire. But breaking formation had a price. The brass widow was now exposed, and Oberleutnant Wolf, circling high above in his Fu 190, had just found his target. The air inside the bomber was thick with the choking stench of burnt cordite and vaporized hydraulic fluid. Empty brass casings covered the floor of the waist section, rolling and clinking like deadly coins over the freezing metal deck. Elias Ford stood, amidst the chaos, like a conductor commanding an orchestra of violence. He was no longer just shooting, he was choreographing the battle. His mind, broken by the rigid structures of military protocol back home, thrived in the chaotic, high-stakes geometry of aerial combat. To the other crewmen, the sky was a terrifying blur of flashing metal, smoke, and sudden death. To Ford, it was a massive, three-dimensional chalkboard. He saw vectors, closing speeds, and intersecting trajectories. "Pilot, I require a violent yaw to the port side in 5 seconds, Ford commanded over the intercom. Up in the cockpit, Captain Blake was sweating despite the freezing temperatures. His arms ached from wrestling the heavy controls. "Ford, I can't keep throwing this ship around. The airframe wasn't built for evasive maneuvers. The airframe is currently taking 50% less damage than the statistical average for this sector, Captain. Yaw port on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark!" Blake cursed, stomped on the left rudder, and hauled the yoke. The brass widow slid sideways through the air, groaning in protest. Rivets popped along the bulkheads, sounding like pistol shots inside the cabin. A pair of Focke-Wulfs tore past their starboard side, their guns blazing, tearing empty sky exactly where the B-17's engines had been a second before. As they shot past, Ford's heavily modified waist guns tracked them perfectly. With a tap of his foot on a custom-built pedal, he bypassed the safety restrictors, unleashing a blinding barrage. The trailing Fu-190 took a concentrated burst directly into its cockpit. The canopy shattered, and the plane slumped, diving vertically into the clouds below. "Splash 3, Corporal Hayes whispered into his radio mic, staring at Ford in absolute awe. "He's not a man, he's a machine." But the German hunters were relentless. Oberleutnant Wolf, observing the destruction of 3 of his men by a single, erratic bomber, signaled his squadron to change tactics. No more lone wolf passes. They would use the swarm tactic, attacking in coordinated groups of 4, overwhelming the gunners with multiple targets from different vectors simultaneously. Wolf keyed his throat mic. "Focus on the stray bomber. Target its waist and tail. Leave the engines. I want the gunners dead." At 24,000 feet over the German border, the sky turned into a localized hell for the Brass Widow. The main bomber stream was steadily pulling ahead, leaving Blake's crippled ship isolated. "Captain, we're falling behind," O'Connor warned, checking his instruments. "We've lost too much speed with these maneuvers. We are officially a straggler." "I know," Blake replied grimly. "Ford, we are exposed. We need to get back to the box." "Negative, Captain." Ford's voice was eerily calm. "Rejoining the box is mathematically impossible at our current drag coefficient. Furthermore, if we attempt a straight-line acceleration, we will present a zero deflection target to the 12 fighters currently queuing up for a pursuit curve attack." "12? O'Connor gasped. He craned his neck, looking out the side window. His blood ran cold. Trailing behind them, forming up like wolves circling a wounded elk, were over a dozen Few 190s and BF 109s. They were pacing the bomber, staying just out of the effective range of the standard .50 caliber guns, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "They're setting up for a synchronized run," Ford stated, his hands flying over his central gearbox, adjusting a series of heavily tensioned springs. "They intend to overwhelm our defensive fields of fire." "What the hell do we do?" Blake demanded. "Ford, your magic guns can't shoot in 4 directions at once." "No, Captain, they cannot. But they don't have to." Ford reached into one of the empty ammunition crates and pulled out a heavy canvas bag. He unzipped it, revealing a spool of thick, braided steel wire and several heavy, lead-weighted grappling hooks equipment, absolutely not standard issue for an 8th Air Force gunner. "Hayes," Ford ordered, not looking at the radio operator, "I need you to open the starboard floor hatch, the one we use for the chaff dispenser." Hayes blinked, paralyzed by fear. "Open the hatch? Are you crazy? The wind will suck us out. Clip your harness, Corporal, and open the hatch. Then, prepare to feed this wire out when I give the command." Ford turned back to his guns. He wasn't aiming at the fighters behind them. Instead, he was pointing his synchronized waist guns downward, at a steep angle toward the earth. "Ford, what are you doing?" Blake yelled over the intercom. "They are coming from behind." "I am aware, Captain. Please maintain your current altitude, but prepare for a sudden, massive deceleration." Oberleutnant Wolf watched the B-17 from his cockpit, a cruel smile touching his lips. The bomber was out of tricks. It was flying straight and level, a sitting duck. He keyed his radio. "All units, attack on my mark. Concentrate fire on the fuselage." The German fighters throttled up, their radial engines screaming as they closed the distance. 300 yards, 200 yards. "Now, Hayes, throw it out," Ford shouted. Hayes shoved the heavy canvas bag through the open floor hatch. The wind instantly caught it, unraveling the thick steel wire at lightning speed. The lead-weighted grappling hooks trailed far behind and below the brass widow, whipping violently in the slipstream. At that exact moment, Ford squeezed the triggers of his waist guns, but he didn't aim at the fighters. He fired a continuous, incredibly dense stream of armor-piercing rounds directly into his own trailing steel wire. The result was something out of a nightmare. The heavy, .50 caliber rounds struck the weighted hooks and the braided wire, shattering the lead and steel into hundreds of unpredictable, hypervelocity fragments. Ford was using his own trailing wire as a massive fragmentation grenade, detonating it in midair, right in the flight path of the pursuing fighters. The leading wave of 4 Few 190s flew directly into the shrapnel cloud. It was instantaneous devastation. The unpredictable fragments tore through wooden propellers, shattered armored glass, and punctured radiators. 2 of the F-190s suffered catastrophic engine failures, spewing thick black oil over their windshields before dropping out of the sky like stones. A third fighter caught a piece of the steel wire directly in its air intake, causing the engine to violently seize and tear itself off the mounts. The plane flipped end over end, snapping its wings off. "Splash 4, 5, and 6, Ford announced, his voice straining slightly as he fought the recoil of his overheating guns. Wolf, flying slightly above the first wave, pulled up hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched in absolute horror as 3 of his best pilots were swatted from the sky by a tactic that defied all military logic. What kind of monster is flying that plane? Wolf thought, his anger boiling over into pure, unadulterated rage. Inside the Brass Widow, the mood wasn't triumphant, it was terrified. The violent drag from the wire and the sheer recoil of the continuous firing had severely stressed the bomber's airframe. The rivets holding the waist section together were beginning to pop, pinging around the cabin like loose bullets. "Ford!" Blake screamed, fighting the yoke as the bomber threatened to stall. "You're tearing the ship apart. We can't take much more of this." "We have to take it, Captain," Ford replied, calmly reloading his custom feed chutes. "Because I have just deeply insulted the commanding officer of that Luftwaffe squadron. He is no longer trying to shoot us down for his country. He is trying to kill us for his pride. And pride makes men predictable. Ford looked out the shattered waist window at the remaining 9 fighters, circling high above, regrouping for a massive, final assault. The calculus of death is nearly complete, Ford whispered to himself, his fingers resting lightly on the mechanical triggers. Now, we bring them all into the trap. The altimeter in the cockpit of the Brass Widow trembled at 22,000 feet. The heavy bomber was bleeding altitude, its number 3 engine coughing out thick, oily black smoke that smeared across the frozen plexiglass. Captain Thomas Blake gripped the yoke until his knuckles were white, his entire body aching from the physical exertion of keeping the 30-ton damaged aircraft flying level. "O'Connor, feather number 3!" Blake shouted over the deafening roar of the slipstream tearing through the riddled fuselage. "If that fire spreads to the wing root, we're done." Lieutenant David O'Connor hit the switches, cutting the fuel mixture and feathering the propeller blades to reduce drag. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them flying on 3. The asymmetrical thrust immediately tried to violently pull the bomber to the right, forcing Blake to stand on the left rudder pedal just to maintain a straight heading. "We are sitting ducks, Tom," O'Connor said, his voice stripped of all its usual bravado. He pointed out the starboard window. "Look at them. They aren't just hunting anymore. They're executing an execution." High above, Oberleutnant Heinrich Wolf had rallied his remaining fighters. He had also radioed for backup. 5 more Focke-Wulf 190s from Jägerschwader 1 had dropped out of the scattered cloud cover, joining Wolf's surviving 4. 11 German fighters now circled the Brass Widow in a wide, lazy orbit, like sharks smelling blood in the water. Wolf's voice crackled through the Luftwaffe frequency, cold and precise. "Do not engage in single passes. The American in the waist is using some kind of linked mechanical system. He cannot shoot in 4 directions simultaneously. Staffel 1, you will dive vertically from 12 o'clock high. Staffel 2, you will attack from 6 o'clock low, aiming for the belly. I will lead the remaining 3 directly at his waist from the beam. We overwhelm the machine." Inside the freezing waist of the bomber, the air was a haze of metallic dust and vaporized gun oil. Sergeant Elias Ford was on his knees, not in prayer, but in a frantic, hyper-focused state of mechanical triage. The barrels of his twin, 50 caliber machine guns were glowing a dull, angry cherry red. The ambient temperature was 40 below zero, but the sheer volume of friction from firing thousands of rounds had pushed the weapon steel past its thermal limits. "Ford?" Corporal Hayes yelled, his voice cracking with panic as he stared at the radar sweep and visually tracked the circling fighters. "They're forming up into 3 groups. They're going to hit us from everywhere at once." "I am aware of their spatial distribution, Corporal," Ford replied. He was using a heavy canvas strap, soaked in water from his canteen, to grab the searing hot barrel of the port gun. The water instantly boiled on contact, sending up a cloud of hissing steam. With a violent twist, he unscrewed the ruined barrel and tossed it onto the freezing floorboards. He slammed a fresh, cold barrel into the receiver, locking it in place. "Listen to me, Ford." Blake's voice blasted through the intercom. "We have 11 fighters coming down on us. We have 3 engines. The top turret is jammed, and the ball turret gunner is unconscious from an oxygen line failure. It's just you. I am putting us into a shallow dive to gain speed, but that's all I can give you." "A shallow dive is unacceptable, Captain," Ford said, rapidly calibrating the tension springs on his gyroscopic gearbox. "If you dive, you stabilize our flight path, making us a predictable, mathematical vector. I need you to do exactly the opposite." "What do you want me to do? Flap the wings?" Blake screamed. "I need you to stall the aircraft, Captain." Silence stretched over the intercom, broken only by the howling wind and the distant, high-pitched whine of 11 German fighters pushing their throttles to maximum power. "Say again, Ford?" O'Connor asked, disbelief dripping from his words. "Stall the ship? We drop below 110 miles an hour. This brick will fall out of the sky." "Precisely," Ford said. He stood up, wiping grease and sweat from his forehead, his eyes fixed on the dials of his strange machine. Oberleutnant Wolf has realized my firing arcs are horizontally linked. He is executing a spherical attack to exploit the vertical blind spots. If he attacks from a higher altitude, his closing speed will be over 500 miles an hour. My gyroscopes cannot track a target moving that fast on a vertical y-axis while we maintain forward momentum. But if we stall, we lose all forward momentum. We become a static point in space. If we stall, we drop like a stone. We won't recover in time. Blake argued. You will recover at exactly 14,000 feet, Captain, Ford said, his voice taking on a hard, unyielding edge that brooked no argument. Because at 14,000 feet, the barometric pressure will allow our remaining 3 engines to generate maximum manifold pressure. Stall the ship on my mark, or we die in exactly 20 seconds. Above them, Wolf gave the order. Angriff. The sky tore open. 4. Valve 190s rolled onto their backs and pulled through, diving straight down toward the B-17's nose. Simultaneously, 4 more streaked upward from the cloud deck, aiming for the unarmored belly. Wolf and his 2 wingmen came screaming in from the right flank, guns already winking with deadly intent. Ford! Blake yelled. Wait, Ford commanded. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the closing speeds, the bullet drop, the intersecting lines of the 11 aircraft. He wasn't looking at the planes. He was feeling the vibration of the bomber, timing the exact moment the geometry favored him. 10 seconds, Hayes whimpered, curling into a ball beneath his radio desk. Wait, Ford repeated. The red glow of the tracer, rounds from the diving fighters, began to fill the cockpit windows. 5 seconds, O'Connor screamed. Mark, pull up, hard. Blake didn't think. He reacted. He hauled the heavy steering yoke entirely back into his chest with brutal force, kicking the rudder. The massive bomber, already struggling on 3 engines, pitched its nose violently upward. The airspeed indicator plummeted. 130. 190. The Brass Widow shuddered violently as the airflow separated from the wings. A terrifying, deep groan echoed through the airframe. And then, gravity took over. The bomber stalled. It stopped flying forward and simply fell out of the sky, dropping belly first, like a 30-ton elevator with a snapped cable. The maneuver was so sudden, so utterly contrary to the laws of aerial combat, that it shattered the German attack plan instantly. The 4 fighters diving from above had calibrated their deflection shots for a bomber moving forward at 200 miles an hour. Instead, the bomber vanished beneath them. They fired their 20mm cannons into empty space, and because they were in a steep vertical dive, they couldn't pull up in time. They blew past the falling B-17, passing within 50 feet of its nose. But Ford was waiting. As the bomber fell, experiencing a terrifying few seconds of near-zero gravity, the strain on Ford's gyroscopic gearbox vanished. With the forward momentum gone, the mathematical equation simplified. He didn't have to calculate lead time on the x-axis anymore. Ford gripped the dual-firing handles. As the 4 diving fighters shot past the nose of the stalling bomber, entering his forward waist-firing arc, he depressed the triggers. The twin. 50 calibers roared. The continuous feed chutes pumped armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a blistering rate. Ford tracked the falling fighters, laying a concentrated stream of fire directly down their fuselages. At that point-blank range, the heavy bullets tore through the light aluminum skins of the Focke-Wulfs like a buzzsaw through paper. 2 of the fighters disintegrated instantly, their fuel tanks erupting into blooming fireballs that illuminated the falling bomber. A third took a burst through its cockpit, the plane snapping into a fatal, uncontrollable spin. Splash 7, 8, and 9, Ford muttered, his hands moving flawlessly as the bomber plummeted. But the attack wasn't over. The 4 fighters coming from below had also missed their target due to the sudden stall, but they were now pulling up, right into the airspace the Brass Widow was falling through. And Wolf, coming from the side, was adjusting his aim, determined to end the American anomaly once and for all. The inside of the Brass Widow was a terrifying kaleidoscope of zero gravity and violent vibration. Loose ammunition, maps, and debris floated through the cabin as the massive bomber plummeted toward the Earth. The altimeter was unwinding at a sickening speed. 18,000 feet, 16,000. We're dropping too fast, Blake screamed, his boots pressed hard against the instrument panel as he pulled on the yoke, trying desperately to force the nose down to catch the wind and regain lift. The controls are mush. She won't recover. Maintain the stall for 4 more seconds, Captain. Ford's voice was an icy anchor in the chaos. Down in the waist, Ford was fighting a battle against physics. His boots were locked into heavy metal stirrups he had bolted to the floor. Hours before takeoff, keeping him grounded while Hayes floated helplessly near the ceiling of the radio room. The 4 German fighters that had attacked from below were now climbing straight up, their engines straining, right into the path of the falling B-17. They are in the lower arc, Ford said softly. He didn't aim the guns with his hands. He used his body weight, leaning violently backward in his stirrups, hauling the heavy, mechanically linked guns to point almost straight down through the open waist window. The gyroscope screamed, the gears grinding against the unnatural angle. Ford squeezed the triggers. Firing heavy machine guns straight down while falling at terminal velocity sent a massive shockwave through the weakened airframe. But the geometry was perfect. The climbing German fighters were moving directly into the stream of falling lead. It was like pouring boiling water down an anthill. The lead Bf-109 flew straight into the burst. The 50 caliber rounds shattered its engine block and sheared off the propeller. The fighter stalled, hung in the air for a fraction of a second, and then fell backward, colliding spectacularly with the Fu-190 directly beneath it. Both planes erupted in a tangled mass of burning metal and shredded aluminum. A third fighter, attempting to veer away, caught a glancing burst that shredded its tail control cables, sending it spiraling out of the fight. Splash 10, 11, and 12, Ford tallied, his voice finally showing a crack of strain. The heat, radiating from the guns, was searing the exposed skin on his face. "Ford! I can't hold her!" Blake roared. 14,000 feet, we are pulling out, now! Blake and O'Connor hauled back on the yokes with the strength of desperate men. The 3 remaining engines screamed as the denser air at 14,000 feet finally bit into the propellers. The wings of the brass Widow groaned, the aluminum skin rippling as the immense G-forces hit them. The bomber violently pulled out of the dive, leveling off at 13,000 feet, the fuselage shuddering so hard it felt like it would snap in half. Gravity slammed back into the cabin. Hayes crashed hard onto the floor plates, gasping for air. "Level! We're level!" O'Connor yelled, sweat pouring down his face despite the freezing cold. But the victory was short-lived. A devastating hail of 20mm cannon fire ripped through the right wing, tearing a hole the size of a dining table through the flap. Wolf, the German ace, and his 2 remaining wingmen had not missed the stall. Wolf had anticipated the pullout. He had positioned his remaining 3 planes perfectly on the bomber's tail, sitting directly in the blind spot of the ruined tail gunner position. "He's on our 6!" Hayes screamed, looking through a shattered observation blister. "3 of them! They're lining up for the kill." "Ford, can you hit them?" Blake asked, fighting the sluggish controls of the crippled bomber. In the waist, Ford stared at his mechanical marvel. Smoke was pouring from the central gearbox. The violent stall, the extreme angles, and the sheer heat of firing so many continuous rounds had taken their toll. The heavy steel casing of the gyroscope had cracked, and thick black grease was boiling out of the fractured seams. Ford grabbed the dual firing handles and tried to swing the guns toward the tail. They didn't move. "Negative, Captain," Ford said, his voice dropping its mechanical detachment for the first time. "The primary linkage has seized. The heat expansion has fused the transverse gears. I cannot rotate the weapons past the 45-degree mark." "Then we're dead," O'Connor whispered. Wolf knew he had them. The American bomber was flying low, slow, and smoking from 2 engines. The waist gunner's bizarre contraption was finally silent. Wolf keyed his radio. "Target the cockpit. End this." "Captain Blake," Ford said, his voice tight. "There is one final variable in the equation. Make it fast, Ford. They are right behind us. The linkage is jammed because the safety governor on the gyroscope prevented it from exceeding its maximum rotation limit under thermal stress. If I bypass the governor, I can force the gears to turn." "Then do it." Bypassing the governor requires physically holding the engagement pin down while the gears turn. The ambient temperature of the gearbox is currently exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Furthermore, without the governor, the gyroscope will instantly overspin and shatter. The resulting kinetic energy will act as a shrapnel bomb inside the waist section. Blake's blood ran cold. He understood exactly what Ford was saying. Ford, no. If you shatter that gyro, it'll cut you in half. Statistically, the shrapnel will project outward in a radial pattern, Ford replied calmly. If I position myself correctly, there is a 22% chance the vital organs will remain unpunctured. That is a vastly superior probability to the 0% chance of survival we currently face. Ford, that's an order. Do not touch that gear, Blake shouted. Elias Ford didn't answer. He looked out the shattered window. He saw the three Focke-Wulfs closing in, their yellow noses gleaming, the faces of the German pilots visible behind the armored glass. They were 300 yards away and closing. Ford stripped off his thick, fire-retardant flight gloves. He threw them onto the floor. Hayes, Ford said, looking at the terrified radio operator, get behind the bulkhead armor. Now. Hayes didn't argue. He scrambled out of the waist section, throwing himself behind the thick steel plating of the radio room door. Ford took a deep breath. He reached both of his bare hands into the smoking, boiling housing of the central gearbox. The heat was agonizing, an instantaneous, searing pain that tried to shut down his nervous system. His palms pressed against the superheated metal housing, his fingers finding the heavy steel engagement pin that locked the gears in place. The smell of his own burning flesh filled the freezing air. He didn't scream. He simply applied pressure. Captain, Ford gritted out, his teeth clamped together so hard one of his molars cracked. Yeah, hard port. In 3 seconds. Ford, don't do this. 3. Ford pressed the pin down. Searing heat bit down to his bones. Tfo. On. Now. Blake kicked the left rudder and hauled the yoke. The Brass Widow violently slewed sideways, exposing its broadside to the 3 trailing fighters. In the waist, Ford used every ounce of strength in his burning hands to physically force the jammed gears past their breaking point. With a horrific screech of tearing metal, the transverse gears snapped free. The heavy twin, .50 calibers whipped wildly toward the rear of the aircraft, directly at the pursuing fighters. Math, Ford whispered. His hands locked onto the superheated mechanism. He squeezed the triggers. At the exact moment the guns fired, the overstressed, ungoverned gyroscope finally failed. Spooling at over 10,000 revolutions per minute, the heavy steel disc violently shattered. The explosion inside the waist section was deafening. Jagged pieces of white-hot steel tore through the fuselage like artillery shrapnel. Ford was thrown backward by the concussive force, his body slamming brutally against the opposite wall. But his final equation was flawless. As the gyroscope detonated, the twin guns fired one last massive, uncontrolled burst, sweeping an exact 90-degree arc across the sky. The sheer density of the fire was staggering. Wolf and his 2 wingmen, flying in a tight V formation just 200 yards away, flew directly into the wall of lead. The left wingman's plane simply evaporated, the heavy rounds detonating its bomb load. The right wingman caught a line of fire straight across his cockpit, the plane immediately nosing down into a fatal dive. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wolf, the veteran ace, saw the flash of the guns a fraction of a second before the bullets struck his aircraft. The armor-piercing rounds shattered his engine, tore off his right wing, and ignited the main fuel tank. The Focke-Wulf exploded into a brilliant orange fireball, leaving nothing but burning debris falling toward the German countryside. Splash. 13, 14, and 15, Ford whispered, slumping onto the freezing, blood-slicked floorboards of the ruined waist section, his hands charred and his uniform soaked in crimson. He looked up at the gaping holes in the roof of the bomber, watching the sky turn quiet. He had 2 planes left to hit his ultimate calculation, but the Brass Widow was bleeding to death, and so was he. The silence inside the Brass Widow was heavier than the roar of the flak had been. It was the desperate gasp of a dying machine. The number 3 engine was a blackened husk. Number 2 was hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid, coughing with a sickly rhythm that shook the airframe. Captain Thomas Blake fought the heavy yoke with every ounce of remaining strength, his shoulders burning as he battled the bomber's severe rightward yaw. They had descended to 8,000 feet, bleeding altitude with agonizing slowness over the flooded fields of the Dutch coast. The sun was sinking, painting the battered aluminum skin in the blood-red light of dusk. Back in the devastated waist section, the freezing wind shrieked through massive holes ripped by cannon fire. Corporal Samuel Hayes crawled from the radio room, finding Sergeant Elias Ford collapsed against the floorboards. Ford's breathing was shallow. His bare hands were a horrific ruin of blistered flesh, the brutal cost of manually holding the superheated gear pin. The central gearbox, his mechanical masterpiece, was just a smoking crater of fused steel. "Ford," Hayes choked out. "Stay with me. We're crossing the coastline. We're going home." Ford's pale eyes fluttered open. His mind, though battered by shock, was still calculating. "Corporal," he whispered, "airspeed and altitude? 140, 8,000 and dropping. And our payload? The bombs are still in the belly." The release lever jammed. Ford closed his eyes. The equation is still unbalanced. The daylight fighters are gone, but twilight brings radar-equipped night fighters. On cue, Lieutenant O'Connor's panicked voice crackled over the intercom. "Contacts at 6 o'clock low." Two dark, twin-engine silhouettes emerged from the gloom. Messerschmitt Balfe 110S. "We're completely defenseless," Blake said, despair creeping in. "We are a 30-ton mass, carrying 4,000 pounds of explosives," Ford countered weakly. "Drop us to 50 feet above the waves, Captain. Maintain exactly 150 miles an hour." "50 feet?" O'Connor shouted. "We'll hit the ocean." "Do it. Hayes, take the crash axe to the Bombay catwalk. Strike the secondary retaining pin. The doors will fall open." Blake shoved the yoke forward, diving toward the dark waters of the North Sea. They leveled out mere feet above the Whitecaps, leaving a violent wake. Behind them, the lead beach, 110, dropped low, lining up to fire. "He's right behind us!" O'Connor screamed. "Strike the pin, Hayes," Ford ordered. Hayes swung the heavy axe, shattering the warped pin. The bay doors slammed open. "Pull the salvo release," Ford yelled. Blake yanked the red lever. 8500 pound bombs fell. Because they were flying mere feet above the water at high speed, the bombs didn't sink, they skipped. Like massive, deadly stones, the explosives violently bounced off the ocean's surface, hurtling directly into the path of the night fighter. The lead Balfe 110 flew straight into the skipping ordnance. A 500-pound bomb smashed through its cockpit, detonating a split second later. The Messerschmitt was vaporized in a blinding flash. Splash 16, Ford exhaled, slumping against the cold aluminum. The second BF-110, piloted by a cautious veteran, didn't fall for the low-altitude trap. Instead, the night fighter pulled into a steep climb, securing the high ground for a lethal diving pass on the Brass Widow's defenseless tail. "He's diving!" O'Connor screamed. "We have no guns, no bombs. We're empty." In the ruined waste, Elias Ford forced himself upright. His severely burned hands trembled, but his mind was locked on the final calculation. "Maintain a steady climb, Captain," Ford rasped over the intercom. "We are going to alter our mass." Ignoring Corporal Hayes's protests, Ford began an agonizing crawl toward the tail compartment. The freezing wind battered his failing body. Beneath the shattered floorboards sat the bomber's heaviest remaining assets, the heavy steel tail wheel assembly and a 600-pound bin of linked .50 caliber ammunition. The roar of the diving Messerschmitt shook the aluminum hull. Deadly 20mm tracers walked across the dark water, reaching for the B-17. Ford wedged his boots against a structural rib. He thrust his raw, burned hands into the slipstream, gripping the heavy external release pins. "Math," he whispered. He pulled. With a violent crack, the pins sheared. Over 1,000 pounds of steel and lead tore away from the bomber's belly. Relieved of the extreme aft weight, the Brass Widow's nose pitched upward violently, instantly killing its forward airspeed. The diving German pilot, anticipating a steady target, roared directly beneath the stalling B-17, straight into the falling mass. The heavy ammunition belts and steel strut shredded the BF-110's engines and canopy. It snapped into a fatal roll, exploding into the freezing channel. "Splash 17, Hayes gasped. But when Captain Blake called for his gunner, only the howling wind answered. The violent pitch had torn the weakened tail cone entirely away. Sergeant Elias Ford had balanced the final equation, offering his own life to the dark sky to bring his crew home. The legend of the Brass Widow and her phantom gunner became a whispered myth in the mess halls of the 8th Air Force. Official records cited Captain Blake's exceptional piloting and a navigational anomaly for the destruction of 17 German fighters, burying Elias Ford's unauthorized genius deep within classified files to avoid admitting a court-martialed prisoner had outperformed their finest gunnery doctrines. Ford's mechanical marvels were quietly scrapped by military intelligence, dismissed as the erratic, unreplicable work of a broken mind. Yet, those who flew that day knew the truth. Elias Ford didn't see a war of ideologies or nations. He saw a ruthless, unbalanced equation in the freezing skies. He weaponized mathematics, turning physics into an art form, and ultimately proved that the margin between absolute destruction and miraculous survival could be calculated, provided one was willing to pay the final, unthinkable price to solve it.